For the background to American involvement in Vietnam, we must go back to a shell-cratered place called Dien Bien Phu. Supplied only by air, completely surrounded by the opposing Vietnamese, French troops were fighting the last battle of a long war over what had been called French Indochina. It's a strange three-cornered struggle. Non-communist Vietnamese fighting communist Vietnamese, some of both fighting French.
The French fought a war that was based on different things. They fought a very conventional war as well in the north with organized units conducting operations similar to what we did initially in the south, using technology we felt wasn't adequate for the task, and so we'll go in and use those kind of tactics with better technology when we'll think that'll be part of the answer. The French also fought a very tactical war, if you will. They would go out in small units and seek out the enemy in a personal, hand-to-hand kind of way, whereas American forces are going to emphasize larger unit actions, and they're going to emphasize firepower, artillery support, and air versus going in and fleshing these people out by physical contact, if you will. And that's just, it might be a lesson we should have learned from the French, but it's totally counter to the American experience or the American way of war. We would prefer to expend firepower and munitions as opposed to lives.
By 1954, the inevitability of a French defeat had become clear. Hanoi in 1954 reflects the ravages of long and bitter warfare. But for now, the fighting's over. The French are leaving. The Red Star flies over Hanoi. The communist forces move in. At a conference in Geneva, an agreement has been reached. It divides Vietnam into North and South, turns over the North to the communists, and marks the end of French colonial rule. The agreement also provides the machinery for bringing true peace to Vietnam, if the communists act in good faith. This is a bright victory for the communist world, and there are smiles. But not on the faces of the more than 1 million Vietnamese who deserted their homes and fled southward rather than live under a communist regime. Many left also because they had sided with the French, or out of religious or economic necessity. In 1954, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, as Korea was divided at the 38th. She faced the future with an imaginary line running across the country, symbolizing a separation which was far from imaginary. In the north, Ho Chi Minh, communist leader of North Vietnam, played the kindly, smiling grandfather. But behind the smile was a mind determined to see a united Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh is a father figure in North Vietnam, and he really got his start as a radical in the period before World War II. He's in France studying, and he gets involved in socialism and communism and those kinds of ideas. He goes home, starts to foment those kind of ideas. He's seen by the French as kind of a radical, but he really isn't much of a force to be reckoned with until the Japanese move in to Indochina, and he begins to lead this resistance movement, forms a resistance, begins to lead this movement against the Japanese, again receiving support from the Allies, specifically American support with both advisors and armament on a small scale, and is seen by the Vietnamese as they transition from the war against the Japanese to a new war against French colonialism, as kind of the father of their country, their founding leader.
American involvement had begun during World War II as OSS teams advised Vietnamese insurgents against the Japanese. However, as the communists increased their pressure on South Vietnam, its leaders asked for greater support to resist that pressure. So increasing communist aggression called forth increases in the scope of United States support. The U.S. was committed to stopping the march of what was seen as a monolithic communist threat. The election process called for in the Geneva Peace Accord broke down when the two sides each accused the other of rigging elections. As an added incentive for the West, the southern portion of the country was much more sparsely populated than the North. In 1954, President Eisenhower pledged economic aid to assist the government of the Republic of Vietnam in developing and maintaining a strong, viable state. America would make South Vietnam capable of resisting attempted subversion and aggression through military means. Land reforms attempted to redistribute farmlands in the South so that farmers could reap for themselves the fruits of their toil. With American economic aid, the South began to prosper, and hopes increased for a new Vietnam. These hopes, shared by so many in Southeast Asia, were reinforced at Manila, when in 1955 the United States and others signed the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty, forming SEATO, which guaranteed the mutual security of Southeast Asia from armed aggression. If the South could not be brought under Hanoi's control by less forceful means, a new phase of the communist plan was ready to go into action. Guerrilla warfare, furtive and remorseless, aimed at destroying the government of South Vietnam. To Hanoi, it was a war of liberation. It did not seem so to the South Vietnamese leaders. This was the prize the communists were after: South Vietnam, rich in rice, and standing at the gateway to the rice-rich nations of Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Burma, and East Pakistan. There were also natural resources: coal, phosphate, zinc, tin, manganese, the raw materials on which to base industrialization. Also natural rubber, which had long been the basis of the French colony's economy. By 1960, every area of life in the South has become a combat zone. This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. But this is really war. It's guided by North Vietnam, and it is spurred by Communist China. By 1961, the South Vietnamese are hard-pressed and send out an urgent call for help. The answer to that call was prompt in arriving. America promised substantial military and technical aid, machines and equipment to resist aggression. The number of advisors grows in an effort to teach Vietnamese fighting forces how to put the new equipment to effective use. The American advisors were specialists, highly trained and motivated, often able to speak to the trainees in their own language. Instructors and advisors willing and able to teach the men of the Vietnamese forces, who are generally eager and quick to learn. Meantime, in addition to training Vietnamese fighting men, American advisor teams were working constantly to help relieve the human suffering of remote villages. Under pressure of growing communist aggression, the flow of American equipment and advisors also increased. American leaders saw this guerrilla warfare as a tactic in the global communist plan. They did not see it for what perhaps it was: a civil war. America felt a global commitment then to support the South Vietnamese in their efforts to stem the rising tide of infiltration and attack from the North, especially since aggressive guerrillas with no citizenry to protect can tie up forces 10 times their own number. American-style organizations with superior equipment and mobility were used to increase the ability of the ARVN to carry the fight to the enemy swiftly whenever its presence became known. However, this was a new kind of enemy and war, and increasingly the ARVN were being defeated. There were no front lines here. The war was everywhere, against an enemy that was seldom clearly seen. American organizations, equipment, and tactics in the hands of the South Vietnamese were found to be wanting. losses mounted as the enemy was never very far away, certainly within shouting distance. Throughout this time, American advisors worked to bring the level of training and combat readiness of South Vietnamese forces up as high as possible. But as North Vietnam continued to support the Viet Cong with supplies and fresh cadres, there was a growing need in South Vietnam for fighting men. The losses suffered by the South in combat were cruelly heavy for a nation whose population was no larger than that of New York State. The South appeared to be losing, but American military leaders strongly recommended against direct U.S. involvement in the war, while the civilian leaders of the United States struggled with how to save the South and stabilize the situation. Then in August of 1964, the scope of the conflict changed when North Vietnamese patrol boats and U.S. destroyers clashed in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Renewed hostile action against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight. Air action is now in execution against certain supporting facilities in North Vietnam, which have been used in these hostile operations.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident is this, many would say it was a setup by the American government to arouse the American people to allow us to intervene in the war. But there does seem to be some hard evidence of an actual torpedo boat attack against American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, resulting in an exchange of fire and causing the American government to be outraged by this attack in international waters. It's seen as a widening of the war by the North Vietnamese government, which leads to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the insertion of more American combat power on the ground in South Vietnam, and the application of American aerial power, if you will, against North Vietnam in an effort to punish them or cripple their ability to wage the war, to support the war in South Vietnam.
Later in August, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara gave these thoughts to the American public.
We wish to emphasize we seek no wider war. Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese. The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north into the south.
This is one captured shipment of Viet Cong arms that the American government used as proof of the infiltration. There are 1 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 3,500 rifles, submachine guns, and some 4,000 anti-tank and mortar rounds. And there's no doubt about the source. The Chinese markings are unmistakable. To meet the aggression so clearly evidenced here, the U.S. meant to show strength and resolution.
We do not seek the destruction of any government, nor do we covet a foot of any territory. But we insist, and we will always insist, that the people of South Vietnam shall have the right of choice, the right to shape their own destiny in free elections in the South or throughout all Vietnam under international supervision. And they shall not have any government imposed upon them by force and terror, so long as we can prevent it. We do not want an expanding struggle with consequences that no one can foresee, nor will we bluster or bully or flaunt our power. But we will not surrender, and we will not retreat.
As the diplomatic effort continued, American advisors and their compounds in Vietnam came under increasing attacks. American support troops and installations became targets. Targets that South Vietnamese forces were unable to fully protect. But in this war against people, the high explosives were not only aimed at men who bear arms. The American embassy in Saigon itself becomes a grim battleground scene as Viet Cong terrorists single it out for a bomb attack. It was all part of a carefully planned and continuing campaign of terror against both American and South Vietnamese civilians. The risks for Americans were real, just as the stakes for which they struggled were real.
Most of the non-communist nations of Asia cannot by themselves and alone resist the growing might and the grasping ambition of Asian communism. We intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms or by superior power. I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs.
For the first time, combat units of the United States Marine Corps arrived in Vietnam, joining the other U.S. servicemen already there. It was the first time that Marines in full combat gear had hit the beach in an active combat zone since Korea. Army combat units also arrived, and the message of their presence on Vietnamese soil was plain. Americans were staying and would defend themselves. Upon commitment to the war, the military leaders gave up their reservations and pressed for the ability to pursue offensive action. The axiom being the best defense is a good offense. The American leaders felt that this new form of aggression must be defeated and proven unprofitable, where the communists would be encouraged to try it elsewhere.
The war will change complexion with the insertion of large American ground units. And the early days of the conflict with American units involved in Vietnam will see some almost crushing victories by American forces against Viet Cong units who attempt to fight a stand-up battle with the Americans. You have the Marine operation in the Central Coast will crush a Viet Cong battalion against the water, basically, and pretty much destroy it. You'll have the an operation by the 173rd Airborne Brigade and some Vietnamese units in the Mekong Delta. That's Operation Marauder, and they'll go down there and destroy one Vietnamese Viet Cong battalion and destroy the headquarters of the 2nd Battalion. And again, a very successful operation. Probably the most famous initial fight will be in the Ai Drang Valley with the 1st Air Mobile or 1st Air Cavalry Division going into action in the Ai Drang Valley, and they'll be engaged by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in a stand-up fight, and American firepower and air power will be applied along with air mobility and the insertion of reinforcements, and will be seen to be very successful. And the Americans will carry away from those initial successes the idea that conventional forces can find and crush these insurgent guerrilla forces in the stand-up kind of conventional war, and that'll form the basis for the search and destroy missions and the big sweeps that will come throughout the war and as the war progresses for the Americans on the ground.
The primary source of units for early deployment to Vietnam was the Strategic Army Forces, or STRAFE. STRAFE units were maintained in the United States for short notice commitment anywhere in the world. However, in meeting and sustaining commitments in Vietnam, the Army had to draw on the technical skills and leadership contained in these units. In addition to units, most STRAFE organizations provided individual replacements for Vietnam. Increased requirements for soldiers caused training center capacity to grow from a population of approximately 115,000 in July 1965 to a figure almost double that in 1967. The 16 training centers benefit directly from the Vietnam combat experienced instructors and the highly qualified and specially selected drill instructors. These trainers represent a prime block of 44,000 men drawn from the Army's combat-skilled manpower resources. But even more, they comprise a group of professionals who have demonstrated their determination and devotion to their trainees by providing them with knowledge and skills needed to face the enemy. All personnel being assigned to Vietnam received special training for service in that country. Lessons learned in Vietnam were incorporated in the regular basic combat training, advanced individual training, and unit training at posts throughout the United States.
The preparedness of American soldiers in Vietnam is one of the issues that historians and military officials have gone over and over and over again. Early in the war, when the American forces first went in, there were a lot of career NCOs. They had combat experience in Korea for the most part. The Army was pretty well trained. The soldiers were draftees, but there hadn't been a lot of changes to the draft system or a lot of exemptions put in place. So, generally speaking, the Army that goes to Vietnam early in the war is fairly well trained, very well equipped. The leaders are career people with a lot of experience.
Selected officers and non-commissioned officers are given special jungle warfare training. The U.S. had to activate, train, and deploy many types of units, such as aviation companies, which did not exist in the Army's structure in sufficient quantities. By the end of the fiscal year 1966, the OCS output totaled 3,600, nearly twice the size of the original program. Additional schools opened to train officers in specialist branches of the Army. The Army's Officer Candidate School output for fiscal year 1967 reached 19,000, a more than five-fold increase over the previous year, with a subsequent dilution of the quality of the leader produced. But American military leadership felt required to put a positive spin on the situation.
As the war progresses, the draft system's tweaked a little bit. There are more exemptions. Different segments of society perhaps are excluded or allowed to avoid service. You get, because of the increase in forces and the worldwide commitment of the Army, you get a dilution of leadership. By that I mean the sergeants and the lower grade officers didn't have the experience in combat before. They were being brought in and trained faster. The force had increased vastly, so the number of people required was greater. So the services weren't as selective, and all these factors combined with what's going on in Vietnam and what's going on in society tends to reduce the level of training and experience in the Army. So the Army late war is much different and not as good as the Army in the early war.
The American soldier was once again in the vanguard in a national effort to bring political justice to South Vietnam. The battle was just warming up, and American involvement in this jungle war would grow to unimagined levels. The American military and the nation itself would never be the same.